The man I was supposed to trust more than anyone in the world sold my inheritance. Without even telling me, he thought I'd be left powerless. But he never realized that I wasn't someone who let betrayal slide. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. It all began on a day that seemed ordinary at first. The kind of day when you wake up expecting the world to hum along exactly as it always has. I was sipping my morning coffee, enjoying the quiet hum of my apartment, when a call from a real estate agent shattered that sense of calm. At first, I thought it was some clerical mistake. I never imagined that the words on the other end of the line would feel like a punch to the gut. My brother had sold the property that was part of my inheritance without even asking me. Not a call, not a message, nothing. He had gone behind my back and liquidated a piece of my family's legacy. The tangible proof of years of effort, planning, and trust that I had shared with him. I remember that first wave of disbelief, the way it hit me like an icy wind. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach as I tried to process the reality. The agent calmly listed the details, but I could hardly listen. My mind was buzzing with questions and the first, unavoidable sting of betrayal. How could someone I grew up with, someone I thought I could trust, treat me with such disregard? It wasn't just money, it was the principle, the respect, the understanding that siblings, especially grown siblings, are supposed to honor each other's rights. That understanding had been violated. I thought about the countless conversations we'd had about the property over the years, planning, dreaming, joking about what we would do with it someday. He had been part of all of those discussions. And yet, in a moment that felt like a slap to the face, he erased all of that shared history with a single selfish act. I felt the tight, frustrating coil of anger begin to build. It wasn't the sale itself that made me want to scream, it was the fact that he thought he could do it quietly, thinking I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't care, that I'd let him get away with it. As I sat there, the initial shock slowly morphing into a steady, simmering fury, I realized this was the point of no return. This was the moment that made me understand the story wasn't over yet, and that the scales of justice, if I had to, would be balanced by my own hands. I couldn't let this slide. My brother's mistake wasn't just a financial one, it was a moral one. And while I didn't yet know exactly how I would respond, one thing was clear. This betrayal would not go unchallenged. It was the start of a story I never wanted to be part of, but it had become mine, and I was determined to see it through to the end. Before everything went wrong, life with my brother had seemed normal. At least, normal enough that I never imagined this betrayal coming. We grew up together, sharing the usual sibling squabbles, holidays, and late-night conversations. He was my brother, sometimes infuriating, sometimes charming, but always family. I had always assumed that family meant trust, that the unspoken bond we shared would prevent him from ever crossing a line like this. I, for my part, had always tried to be responsible and fair. I worked hard, saved diligently, and made decisions with careful thought. My world was orderly and deliberate, and I valued fairness above all else. That's why the thought that someone I loved and trusted could act with such disregard felt like a personal violation. I had approached life thinking that honesty and integrity were default values in the people around me, and in my brother. I assumed the same in my brother, on the other hand, had always been a bit more impulsive, charismatic, quick-witted, and able to charm his way out of most minor mistakes. He was the kind of person who believed the world owed him favors, sometimes before he had earned them. He had a tendency to act first and think later, a way of rationalizing selfish choices with a confident smile. Those traits had occasionally frustrated me over the years, but I had never considered them dangerous. I thought I knew the boundaries he respected, but clearly, I had been mistaken. Our family dynamic had always been built around shared responsibilities and mutual respect. Or so I thought. The inheritance in question was never just about money. It represented years of careful planning by our parents, their hopes for both of us, and the idea that we would honor each other in handling it. I had always assumed that when the time came, we would consult each other, discuss our options, and make decisions together. That had been my expectation, my baseline of trust. Looking back, there had been small warning signs, little moments, where he prioritized his own convenience over fairness, or where he subtly tried to manipulate outcomes in his favor. At the time, I had dismissed them as minor annoyances or youthful recklessness. Perhaps I wanted to believe in the best of him. Or perhaps I just didn't want to imagine that someone I loved could truly act without regard for me. Either way, those signs were faint whispers of the storm that was about to hit. This was the world before the line was crossed. A family that appeared close. To siblings who had always shared the same upbringing and values, but with underlying differences in character that I had chosen to overlook. I believed in honesty and accountability. He believed, perhaps, that charm and opportunism could carry him farther than integrity ever could. I had no idea how drastically the equilibrium of our relationship was about to be shattered, and I certainly had no idea how my next steps would shape the rest of our lives. The moment I realized everything had changed arrived like a sudden, harsh crack in the air, a moment so sharp it cut through the familiar rhythm of my life. I had expected a phone call, maybe an email, something that indicated my brother had at least considered speaking to me before taking a major action. But there was nothing. Instead, the reality hit me through cold. Official channels, a property that had always been mine in part. A piece of my inheritance that symbolized years of family planning and parental foresight, had been sold completely, irrevocably, and without my consent. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the documents the real estate agent had emailed me, my coffee long gone cold, the signatures on the sale, the dates, the transfer of ownership. It was all there in black and white. He had done it. He had crossed the line that I had never imagined he would. A knot of disbelief twisted in my stomach, and a chill ran down my spine. My hands shook slightly as I reread the email, hoping against hope that somehow there had been a mistake, some clerical error that would absolve him of what he had done. But the facts were undeniable. I thought about all the conversations we had shared over the years, the plans we had made, the jokes about what we would do with the property when the time came. And suddenly, every word felt like a lie, every memory tainted by his selfishness. How could someone I loved and trusted erase all of that in a single, thoughtless act? The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal. He had treated my trust as an obstacle, my rights as optional, and my feelings as irrelevant. The emotions that coursed through me were complex and contradictory. There was disbelief, the raw sting of shock that comes from realizing that someone you relied upon has betrayed you in a way you never thought possible. There was anger, hot and insistent, a fire that rose from the pit of my stomach and made it impossible to sit still. And there was a gnawing, bitter sadness. The kind that comes when the people you love act in ways that prove they do not truly honor you. I felt violated, not just in terms of my inheritance, but in terms of my faith in the relationship itself. I also remember the initial impulse I had. A quiet, almost helpless desire to forgive, to hope that he would call, that he would explain, that he would do the right thing. But as hours passed and no apology came, that impulse faded. I realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding, nor was it a simple mistake. This was a deliberate choice, a conscious decision to prioritize his desires above everything else. That moment of realization was brutal, but it was also clarifying. It made one thing clear. If I wanted justice, if I wanted to protect what was rightfully mine, I couldn't wait for him to act. I had to act myself. By the end of that day, the initial shock had begun to harden into resolve. I knew that moving forward would require more than anger. It would require strategy, patience, and a willingness to confront him in ways I had never imagined. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The story, my story, had officially begun. After the initial shock wore off, I thought confronting my brother would at least bring clarity. I expected denial, maybe some excuse, but I also hoped for a hint of remorse, an acknowledgement that he had overstepped. What I got instead was something far more infuriating. The conversation started calmly, or at least I tried to keep it calm. I called him, trying to keep my voice measured, explaining that I knew about the sale, and asking why he had gone behind my back. At first, he laughed, a light, dismissive chuckle that immediately set my teeth on edge. He brushed it off as if it were no big deal, saying, "It was just easier this way. You wouldn't have agreed anyway." The casualness of his words, the lack of even a hint of remorse, was like a dagger. He wasn't acknowledging the violation. He was justifying it. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. He began telling other family members his side of the story, painting himself as the clever, resourceful sibling and subtly twisting the truth to make it seem like I was overreacting. It was maddening to watch him manipulate the narrative, turning allies against me, or at least planting seeds of doubt. The betrayal was no longer a private pain, it was being amplified in front of everyone, making it feel even heavier. Every interaction with him became an exercise in restraint. He would call, pretending to be casual, dropping comments about the sale, laughing about how easy it had been to pull off, and testing whether I was truly capable of confronting him. Each time, I felt my anger flare, but I knew I couldn't react impulsively. I had to remain measured, to keep my focus on the end goal, which was justice. The tension wasn't just emotional, it started creeping into other aspects of my life. I found myself replaying the event over and over in my mind, imagining ways to confront him, ways to reclaim what was mine. Sleep was difficult. Concentration at work was challenging. He had turned what should have been a family matter into a high-stakes personal conflict, and I was determined not to let him win. By the end of that week, it became clear that this wasn't going to resolve itself. My brother's arrogance, his refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, and his manipulative behavior had escalated the conflict beyond a simple argument. He wasn't just careless, he was actively doubling down, testing boundaries, and challenging me to respond. And respond I would. It was during this period, amidst rising tension and frustration, that I realized I needed a plan. I couldn't rely on his sense of guilt or decency, he had none in this situation. If I wanted to reclaim my inheritance and hold him accountable, I would need to find leverage, evidence, and a method that would guarantee results. The game had changed, and I was no longer playing by his rules. Even after days of manipulation, excuses, and dismissive laughter, I tried to cling to the hope that my brother might at least recognize how far he had gone. Maybe he would see that this wasn't just about property or money, it was about respect, trust, and the boundaries that siblings are supposed to honor. But that hope shattered completely during one particular conversation that still haunts me in memory. It was a casual Saturday afternoon when he called, sounding unusually cheerful. At first, I thought perhaps he had a shred of conscience finally surfacing. But as soon as the words left his mouth, the knot in my stomach tightened into something more tangible: rage, disbelief, and an undeniable clarity. He began boasting, casually, almost gleefully, about how he had sold my inheritance behind my back. He spoke about the sale as though it were a clever trick he had pulled off, the kind of cunning maneuver that made him feel proud rather than guilty. What made it worse was how he framed it. He suggested that I should simply let it go, implying that my outrage was petty, unnecessary, and irrational. His tone was patronizing, and there was an unmistakable smugness in the way he said it, as if my feelings were insignificant compared to his cleverness. That was the final straw. The combination of arrogance, entitlement, and blatant disrespect made me realize that I could no longer hope for a voluntary apology, reconciliation, or even acknowledgement. He had crossed a moral line, and he had no intention of seeing it. At that moment, a profound shift happened within me. The helplessness I had felt after discovering the sale, the frustration of watching him manipulate others, and the simmering anger of being ignored all coalesced into a focused determination. I was no longer a passive observer in this situation. I was an agent of justice. It was time to act, and not just in small, emotional ways, but in a strategic, deliberate, and undeniable manner. I spent the evening going over the legal and logistical details of the property, trying to understand exactly what leverage I had. Every document, every contract, and every signature became a piece of a puzzle. I realized that his overconfidence, his belief that I would never challenge him, was my advantage. He had acted recklessly, assuming that charm, manipulation, and timing could cover for his wrongdoing. That same recklessness would be his undoing by the end of that night. My plan had begun to take shape. I wouldn't let anger drive me blindly. I would let strategy guide me. I would gather evidence, identify weaknesses in his actions, and prepare a methodical response that would ensure he could not escape the consequences of what he had done. For the first time since discovering the sale, I felt a sense of clarity and control. The breaking point had been reached. I was done being the victim. I was ready to reclaim what was rightfully mine and ensure that justice was served. After the breaking point, I knew that sheer frustration or moral outrage would not be enough to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I needed leverage, a concrete, undeniable advantage that would allow me to act decisively. That's when I began poring over the legal documents connected to the property. What I discovered was both a revelation and an opportunity. The sale my brother had finalized was technically flawed. The property had been part of my inheritance, and legally, my signature, or at least my explicit consent, was required for the transaction to be valid. He had assumed that because he was in possession of the paperwork, and the buyer was unaware of my involvement, no one would question the sale. It was a critical oversight on his part, and it gave me exactly what I needed: a unique weapon in the form of undeniable legal leverage. I spent hours gathering every piece of evidence I could: past emails where we discussed the property, notarized family documents, official property records, and communications with the real estate agent. I meticulously compiled everything into a comprehensive file. Every document, every timestamp, every record became a thread in the net I was weaving, a net that would ultimately ensure he could not escape accountability. But it wasn't just about the law. It was about strategy. I realized that confronting him directly without preparation would be futile. He would dismiss me, manipulate the story, or try to sway others to his side. Instead, I had to approach this methodically, ensuring that the moment of confrontation was both undeniable and decisive. I envisioned the eviction, the moment he realized that his actions had finally caught up with him, and the satisfaction that justice would be visible and absolute. This stage of planning also involved mental preparation. I reminded myself that my goal was not petty revenge. It was reclaiming what was mine and ensuring he faced the consequences of his choices. That clarity of purpose helped me stay calm and strategic. I wasn't going to let emotions cloud my judgment. My leverage, the legal flaw in the sale, was a tool that required patience, precision, and timing. By the end of my preparation, I felt a quiet confidence settle over me. I had turned the situation on its head. What he had thought was a clever, risk-free move had given me the power to act decisively. The plan was no longer abstract, it was actionable, intelligent, and fully within my control. My brother had created the circumstances for his own downfall without ever realizing it. And for the first time since the sale, I allowed myself to imagine the moment when I would reclaim both the property and the sense of justice that had been stolen from me. The day I finally put my plan into action, I remember feeling a mixture of nerves, anticipation, and quiet satisfaction. I had done everything carefully, methodically, and legally. There was no room for error. No chance for my brother to twist the outcome in his favor. I hired a lawyer who specialized in property law and explained the situation, providing every document, every email, and every notarized agreement that proved the sale had been invalid without my consent. My preparation had been meticulous, leaving no gaps for doubt or loopholes. The first step was formal, serving my brother with the eviction notice. I watched as the papers were delivered, imagining his reaction, knowing that this was the first tangible consequence he would face for his reckless actions. I had to remain calm during the process, to ensure that every step was professional and legally airtight. I couldn't allow myself to get carried away emotionally. The power of my position lay in precision and certainty, not in theatrics. As the legal process unfolded, I attended every meeting and hearing, presenting my evidence clearly and confidently. Each time my brother attempted to argue, I had already anticipated his moves. His arguments were weak, relying on assumptions and misrepresentations that were easily countered by the documentation I had gathered. The calm authority with which I presented my case was as much a weapon as the legal leverage itself. I could see the shift in the room, the realization dawning on him and everyone present that he had overstepped in a way that could not be undone. What struck me most during this stage was the satisfaction of seeing the plan work exactly as intended. There was no cheating. No luck involved. Every step was the product of careful thought and preparation. As the eviction proceedings moved forward, I could feel the momentum shift. The tables had turned. He was no longer the one in control. I was. The property, my inheritance, the rights that had been violated, all of it was moving back into my hands. Even as I executed the plan, I reminded myself why this was necessary. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about restoring justice and setting boundaries that my brother had ignored. The calm satisfaction that came from knowing the law, evidence, and strategy were on my side made every nerve and every moment of stress worth it. The climax of the plan was approaching, and with it, the moment when my brother would finally understand the consequences of his actions. The moment my brother realized the tide had turned was unforgettable. At first, he tried to maintain his usual air of confidence, shrugging off the eviction notice as if it were nothing more than a formality. But as the legal hearings progressed and the evidence I had meticulously gathered was laid bare, the cracks in his facade began to show. I watched as disbelief slowly gave way to panic, and finally, to the raw, unfiltered anger that comes when someone realizes they are powerless. He lashed out, yelling, blaming the lawyer, blaming me, and even blaming circumstances that were entirely within his control. His usual charm and quick wit were gone, replaced by desperation and rage. Every attempt to manipulate the situation, to twist the facts in his favor, was thwarted by the documentation I had prepared. Emails, notarized agreements, property records, all the proof that the sale had been invalid without my consent left him with no avenue to escape accountability. The look on his face when he fully understood the reality of the situation was one of pure shock. I could see it in the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided making eye contact, and the slight tremor in his hands. For once, the tables had turned completely. He had assumed that he could outsmart me with his charm, his confidence, and his recklessness, but it was precisely that recklessness that had sealed his fate. Family members who had been caught in the middle or swayed by his manipulations began to see the truth clearly. The mask of entitlement and arrogance he had worn for so long had slipped, exposing the reality of his actions. His isolation became tangible. Allies dwindled as the undeniable facts painted him as reckless and unfair. In that moment, the weight of his choices, the deliberate betrayal of trust, and the violation of family bonds landed fully on his shoulders. It was a satisfying, almost poetic moment, not because I reveled in his misery, but because justice had been served. His downfall was not arbitrary or accidental. It was the direct result of his own choices, his own greed, and his own arrogance. And as I stood there, calm and collected, I knew that the scales had been balanced. The confrontation had achieved exactly what it needed to. He was faced with the consequences of his actions, and the world, especially our family, now saw him for who he truly was. The day the eviction was finalized felt like a turning point, not just in the legal sense, but in the emotional landscape of my life. Watching my brother leave the property, the very space he had thought he could claim without consequences, was surreal. I remember standing at a distance, observing quietly, feeling a mix of relief, satisfaction, and an almost surreal calm. This was the culmination of weeks of careful planning, patience, and unwavering determination. And it was unfolding exactly as I had envisioned. As he packed up his few belongings, I noticed the combination of shock, anger, and helplessness etched across his face. He kept glancing at the paperwork in my hands, the legal documents that had been the cornerstone of my plan, as if suddenly realizing the magnitude of his recklessness. No charm, no excuses, no manipulation could undo what had been set in motion. He had created the circumstances for his own downfall, and now he was forced to confront the results of his actions head-on. There was a sense of poetic justice in every detail. He had acted impulsively, believing that he could get away with selling my inheritance, that he could outsmart me and the system. Yet it was precisely that arrogance that led to this public, undeniable defeat. I could see the disbelief in his eyes as he realized that every step he had taken to secure personal gain, without regard for me, had been a mistake with consequences he could not evade. And in that moment, I felt a quiet triumph, the kind that comes from knowing that justice has been delivered fairly and completely. The property was returned to my control, my inheritance restored, and the balance that had been disrupted by his selfish choices was now fully corrected. But more than that, there was a moral satisfaction. He had been held accountable in a way that was a direct and fitting response to his own actions. His downfall was not a fluke or a lucky accident, it was the inevitable consequence of his greed and disregard. As he finally left the property, I took a deep breath, allowing the tension that had built over weeks to finally release. The air felt lighter, the space around me calmer. I knew that the events of the past few weeks had reshaped the dynamic between us. And while our relationship would never be the same, the integrity of what was mine had been restored. The payoff was complete, not just legally, but emotionally, morally, and practically. I had acted decisively, intelligently, and with purpose, ensuring that justice was both seen and felt. In the days and weeks following the eviction, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The tension and uncertainty that had consumed me slowly gave way to a sense of relief and calm. The property was once again firmly under my control, my inheritance restored, and the knowledge that I had acted decisively and successfully created a quiet sense of empowerment that I hadn't felt in a long time. I could finally breathe without the constant weight of betrayal pressing down on me. My brother, on the other hand, faced the consequences of his choices. Family members who had once been swayed by his charm and manipulations now saw him for who he truly was: entitled, reckless, and selfish. Relationships that he had taken for granted were strained, and the credibility he had relied on for so long was damaged beyond repair. Watching this unfold was not about gloating. It was about witnessing justice in its natural course. He had acted without regard for others, and now he bore the consequences of those actions. For me, the experience was transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had always prided myself on patience, fairness, and integrity, but this situation tested those qualities to the extreme. I learned the value of preparation, the importance of standing firm when principles are at stake, and the power that comes from using knowledge and strategy to achieve justice. I also learned that family dynamics can be complicated, and sometimes love and trust are not enough to prevent betrayal, but courage, clarity, and resolve can restore balance. The new normal became a life where I felt secure in my boundaries and confident in my ability to protect what was mine. I moved forward with a stronger sense of self-respect, knowing that I had not allowed injustice to prevail. My brother's downfall served as a constant reminder of the consequences of arrogance and greed. And while our relationship would never be the same, I carried forward a sense of moral clarity and emotional peace. Ultimately, the moral of the story is clear. Betrayal has consequences, but justice can be achieved through intelligence, patience, and perseverance. By standing firm, leveraging what was rightfully mine, and acting decisively, I was able to reclaim both my inheritance and my dignity. The experience left me wiser, stronger, and more aware of the importance of maintaining clear boundaries, trusting my instincts, and confronting wrongdoing head-on.